We brought the master tonight, and again, this is Robert McDonald, who had his own gallery on Union Square for how many years? 30 years?
Too long.
Too long.
200 years.
And he was the primary purveyor of Latin American art in Northern California, and still is. And he's been very encouraging. Some of his material is here tonight. So anyway, without further ado, I wanted Robert to just talk to us a little bit and take some questions about the collecting mania, how to direct it, how to make it more profitable, whatever it is that you're interested in. So, Ernesto?
Yeah, maybe after you talk, we'll just say a few words about this show as well and the galleries that we're collaborating with.
Yeah.
But I think we can maybe start with the program of collecting art.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
You're tall enough, but you can stay.
Yes, you can.
Oh, what an introduction. Anyway, we've been, my wife and I, we started a gallery in 1988 in Oakland. And it was a Latin American art gallery. And the question that most people asked at the time was, what's an Englishman in San Francisco doing collecting Latin American art? So I'll just kind of give you a quick rundown. When I studied art history in England, I spent 6 years at art college in England, there was always a pretty good section on Latin American art. And that was very much to do with the connection between the Surrealists, when in the Second World War, when the Surrealists had to come to the United States, a lot of the Surrealists went down to Mexico and kind of realized Mexico was probably the most surreal country in the world. People like Henri Breton went to Mexico, met up with Trotsky and Diego Rivera. Diego Rivera, I think in 2008, was in Europe working with Picasso and developing Cubism. So there are these big kind of, European American links. When I got to the United States, I was still very much involved in the art scene and giving lectures at art colleges, etc., and teaching. But I found that very few people in the United States knew anything about Latin American art.
Right.
Even people that were involved teaching art knew nothing about Latin American art. So, cut a long story short, from San Francisco we took a trip down to Mexico, and then just kind of seeing the kind of great Diego Rivera murals, Siqueiros, Orozco, becoming acquainted with a lot of other kind of major Mexican artists. When we came back to the United States, I opened the gallery. I started kind of looking at the prices of kind of major Mexican artists compared to what was happening in the United States and Europe. For example, a major print, silkscreen print by Jasper Jones was selling for the same price as a major painting by Fino Tamayo. Now, in art history circles, Tamayo was like up here and Jasper Jones was down there, but the market was completely obscure. So we decided to open up a Latin American art gallery here in San Francisco. One, because we really kind of loved the Mexican art, and secondly, we thought there was kind of a lot of room for growth. So we waited a lot of years for that growth, and it didn't come until about 15 years ago. And if we look at our mailing list pre-15 years ago, there's maybe one name on the mailing list that was Latin American. All the rest were kind of collected from the United States, Europe. Now I would say about 90 to 95% of our collectors are Latin background. So that dynamic has changed dramatically. The other thing we've seen, particularly over the last 3 or 4 years, is I would say there's been more shows for Mexican art internationally than any other art form in the world. So we're looking at major shows in Sydney, Australia, predominantly Mexican artists. We're looking at major shows in England, Ireland, the United States. This is a massive amount of shows for Mexican art. And now collectors, the other thing that's happened, which I was hoping would happen for many years, is each year at Sotheby's and Christie's, they have Latin American art auctions.
Right.
They have them twice a year. I think in May, and then again in November. And they've always done quite well. But as of about 3 or 4 years ago, Sotheby's stopped doing the Latin American art shows. And the Latin American artists were not Latin American artists anymore. They weren't Paul Cousins. They were any of the major European and American artists in the modern impressionist sense. So now we've got people from Europe, the United States, as well as Latin America collecting these artworks. And this has kind of transcended all the way down to the kind of contemporary artists over today out of Latin America. Last year, well, before COVID, the kind of year, the month of COVID broke out, or San Francisco went into lockdown. My son and I were in Mexico City at the great art fair there. That art fair has become one of the most important art fairs in the world. Major galleries from all over the world came to Mexico because that's where the epicenter was for this new kind of energy. So that's the kind of backdrop to where we are right now, and it's just in its infancy. It really is. It's going to grow a lot more. I read a couple of newspaper articles out of Mexico talking about a private sale for a Frida Kahlo painting last month that sold for 130 million. I mean, that is colossal. Back in, I think, 85, 86, there was a show in Arizona for Frida Kahlo, nobody came. And all that changed with I think there's two things happening, you know, the kind of people that started collecting Latin American art. Madonna was one of the first, she owns 3 paintings by Frida Kahlo, so that's kind of driven the prices up. Also, I guess, going back a little bit, why was Mexican culture not acceptable in the United States when I came in 1976? Why weren't people looking at kind of Roberto Marta, Diego Rivera, Siqueiros, Orozco? I think a lot of it was that the big 3, Diego Rivera, Siqueiros, Orozco, were kind of hardline communists. They were affiliated with Trotsky. You have the Cold War going on. So a lot of these artists were kind of kept out of the United States. The other issue is that kind of, as Mexican culture, or Latin culture, has developed more in the United States, particularly food, music, dance, they happen very quickly, so they kind of become part of the American culture. I mean, probably 50% of what we eat now is Mexican food. Probably 80% of the chefs are from Latin America. So that has changed, and it's kind of opened the doorway for people to kind of look at different parts of Latin culture. The arts become very difficult because, you know, you've got a building like this where very few people can get into, and it becomes difficult to kind of get the word out, but it's really happening with a lot of the big museums. There's another show coming up at Christie's, and I believe there's another Frida Kahlo there for 30 million. That's the estimate. I think it will probably get up to around about 100 million. So, I haven't taken it this far. Are there any questions that people have about, I mean, anything that people want to know about the direction of Latin American art and where the best place is to collect it and where you should look at it?
Yes.
Why do you feel like, Mexican art was not as accepted?
My take is that the United States was very Eurocentric.
Yes.
And they wanted their heritage to be that of Europe. French culture was probably the most highly kind of thought about then, England, etc. I talk to people all the time in the United States since I've come here, and they hear my accent, they tell me, oh, my grandfather's English, or Irish. Irish is a big one. There's no Germans. There's just Irish. So this thing about identity is a real strange one. Now it's changed. It really has changed because our children, our families, we all interact together in California. I mean, you can be anywhere, it's kind of such a multicultural landscape. But in 1976, that wasn't the case. It was still very Eurocentric. Mexico's an immigration issue. There's not cultural hotbed. And historically, Mexico in particular has been a fantastic cultural hotbed. Many people don't know that Diego Rivera was very much instrumental in formulating Cubism. And one of his big bust-up with Picasso was about Cubist painting. Because Diego Rivera created this painting called Cubist Landscape. And it had a guitar in there, a revolutionary. And then a few weeks later, Picasso had a show. And he had a painting, it obviously ripped off from Diego Rivera. Diego Rivera said, no, he said, that wasn't done there. And Picasso said, no, I painted this months ago. And Diego went up and kind of touched the painting with the paper still. So I mean, it's a funny kind of story, but the bottom line is, people don't understand that kind of wonderful fusion between what was happening in Europe, the development of kind of modernism, that was also happening in Mexico at the same time. Everybody from, almost all the major painters going to Europe, and after the war, a lot of European painters escaped Europe and came to live in Mexico. And you got people, great Renaissance styles, Carrington, Leonardo Carrington, Ramirez Barro, all these people that kind of really enhanced that kind of wonderful bridge between, the European continent and the Americas. Any other questions? Yeah.
So for those of us here that would consider themselves neophytes, where would you recommend someone to start if they were interested in collecting Mexican or Latin American art?
Well, I mean, I guess people here have made the first step. You come to see a Mexican show. I guess you've got to, you start searching for Mexican museum shows, like right now, I don't know if anybody's been down to the Museum of Modern Art here in San Francisco. Probably the most important piece of artwork that was ever created in the United States by Diego Rivera is on show there. It's a massive, massive mural of the Americans, so even if you don't go inside the building, you can see it at night from outside. It's just absolutely fabulous. They will be having a museum show for Diego Rivera this year. It was supposed to happen last year or the year before, but COVID got in the way. But again, you've got to do your homework a little bit. I mean, if you're looking to collect, you've got to kind of develop your eye. And I think one of the best ways to develop your eye is to buy your first piece of artwork. Because once you've done that, you're kind of committed. And it forces you, almost, to become more and more involved. And look at more and more different places. And it's not about collecting art. Like, when you say collecting things, it's like you're collecting stamps or you're collecting postcards. But when you get involved in art, it's more of a lifestyle choice. And when I think about collecting art, my mind always goes back to the first cave painters and those wonderful paintings in Lascaux. And why were they painting? Why were those painted? Is the reason for painting any different now than it was then? And they kind of reflect the kind of spirituality, the politics, whatever, at each particular time. So when I look at the artwork today, a lot of the contemporary artwork reflects the times we're in. And it doesn't give me great kind of joy, but it's important. Any other questions?
My friend Michael here is a very flourishing business hanging art for clients.
Yeah.
And he's done almost everything in my house. And couldn't get him to come here, he was too busy. We had to do it ourselves, but that's beside the point. But he asked the question that I thought was a good one, is how do you get, say, millennials, Gen Z, how do you get them to appreciate this? Because it seems like it needs an education process.
It does. I noticed some years ago when I went to art fairs. More art fairs are like San Francisco, Lab in Chicago, cities all over the world have art fairs. Miami. For the last 10 years, what I've been seeing at these art fairs and what has been selling really well are these kind of plastic screens that kind of got images on and look like the screen of a computer. Yes. And that is what is selling. And it's just like, okay, I get it. That's your aesthetic. That's what you understand. But like I say, there's got to be an education. They've got to get away from their computers and they've got to kind of understand the wonderful visual quality of looking at something like this. They kind of understand that there's that kind of wood grain behind the piece. This piece by Toledo, same thing. He's taken a piece of wood and carved into it and they've all these kind of wonderful mythological crocodiles. You cannot get that from a computer screen. Yes?
I hope you're not pressed for time with regard to questions.
No.
But I wanted to ask, when you think about this art historically, when you think about Latin American art historically, who do you see as being the artists who were the essential links between Latin American art and Europe? Because I think about Picasso, I think about Dali, but are there others who we should know about so we can appreciate this better?
Oh, they were linked to Europe?
Yes.
Well, as I say, you've got people like Diego Rivera, James Martinez that actually go to Europe, kind of link up with them, but a lot of it was after the Second World War, when many of those artists had to come here. as I mentioned, Muniz Varo, Leonard Carrington, Gunther Goetzel was very kind of instrumental there. Gunther Goetzel was born in Mexico, but of, I think, Hungarian and German parents.
Oh wow.
He went back to Switzerland when he was a young man, but then when the war broke out again, came back here. So this is a Mexican artist. So you see in his work, you see an abstraction form, which is definitely European, but the colour sensibility is definitely Mexican. And then some of the kind of textural kind of qualities it gets are very much like, you know, that beautiful green stone that they quarry in Mexico. Then when it rains, it turns kind of green. He'll use all those kind of colours in his works. Look up André Breton. He was the leader of the Surrealist movement, but again he came to Mexico, met with Diego Rivera. There's a wonderful photograph of André Breton, Diego Rivera and Trotsky all together.
Yeah.
And like, when you see that photograph, you think, wow, that is really kind of neat. And then I can remember some years ago seeing this, well, we'll go into that, it's on often different times, so I'm trying to stick to where I'm going. Anybody else?
Well, what about the link between Picasso and African art, and how that influenced European artists and then influenced Mexico?
Well, yeah, I mean,
Could somebody say
Repeat the question.
repeat the question? We couldn't hear.
well, Vivian was asking about the link between predominantly African art and modernism,
Yeah.
which is massive. I mean, African art kind of dominates the creation of modernism and cubism. The Damsels d'Avignon, which is Picasso's one of his most famous paintings, is obviously taken from African masks. So that does have an influence on Mexican art, but if you look at the Mexican artists were very kind of nationalistic as well, so they take the same concepts and all the same concepts, but they're looking at pre-Columbian art.
Yeah.
So you look at a lot of Tamayo's paintings and Diego Rivera's paintings, and every artist from Mexico has had that wonderful influence of that pre-Columbian culture.
They also collected
They're eclectic. I mean, that's-
all that.
yeah, I can remember
Well,
when it was-
Tamayo has a whole museum.
There's a big show coming up. I was talking to the director of the Tamayo Museum in Mexico. There's a big show coming up for Tamayo at the Tamayo Museum in December this year. With a collection of Tamayo paintings that have never been seen, set against a backdrop or set with pre-Columbian sculptures. But not only that, also folk art from Mexico, which again, the folk art really influenced most of the Mexican. I mean, look at Frida Kahlo. You cannot kind of fail to see the influence of folk art in her work.
Robert, thank you.
Okay,
Thank you very much.